Between March and November 2029, I tracked the migration of 340 tagged blue whales through the Eastern Pacific Corridor. These were animals I knew. Not personally. You don't get personal with a blue whale. But I knew their acoustic signatures, their dive profiles, their feeding patterns, the timing of their songs. I'd been listening to some of them for 3 years. Tagging is intimate in a way that people outside the field don't appreciate. You attach a satellite transmitter to the largest animal that has ever lived on this planet. An animal that weighs 150 tons and moves through water with more grace than anything that size has a right to possess. And then you listen. You follow. You track their position every 4 hours through satellite uplink. You become a witness to a life that is conducted entirely in a medium you can't survive in, at depths you can't reach, over distances that would take you days to travel by ship. You know where they are. You know when they feed, when they sing, when they dive, when they rest. You know them by their tag number and by the shape of their voice. And in 2029, over the course of 8 months, I listened to 112 of those voices go silent. Not dead. There were no carcasses, no acoustic death signatures. The specific patterns of distress calls and biological cessation that hydrophones can detect when a whale dies. No strandings reported on any coast within drift range. The tags simply stopped transmitting, one by one, then in clusters of 3 and 4, all from the same 30-mile stretch of the migration corridor, all from the same depth, 3,200 feet give or take. One at a time, the dots on my tracking map winked out. The tags were designed to withstand the crush depth of a blue whale, over 1,600 feet. They were rated for pressures that would kill a human instantly. Whatever destroyed 112 satellite transmitters in 8 months operated at a force that exceeded the engineering tolerances of equipment built to survive the deepest dive of the largest animal on Earth. And it did it 112 times. In the same location, in a pattern, the Pacific Deep Monitoring Station sat 340 miles southwest of Monterey, above the edge of the Mendocino Escarpment, a deep trench system that drops from 6,000 feet to over 14,000 feet in a geological cliff face that runs east-west across the Pacific floor. The station was a converted oil platform, 4 legs, a main deck, a 2-story operations superstructure, a crane bay for ROV deployment, and a helipad that the helicopter pilot called Optimistic. The platform had been built in the 1990s, decommissioned in 2015, and repurposed by NOAA in 2019 for deep-water acoustic research. The conversion was functional rather than comfortable. The original oil equipment had been stripped, leaving bare steel decks and empty pipe channels. The operations room had been built into the former control center. Banks of monitors, acoustic processing equipment, the hydrophone relay receivers. The crew quarters were containerized units bolted to the main deck. The galley was a shipping container with a stove. Everything smelled like salt and diesel and the particular metallic sweetness of steel that's been wet for 30 years. The crew was 5 during my rotation. Gibson, its station manager, retired Navy, ran the platform systems and pretended the science was over his head, which it wasn't. Reeves, marine technician, maintained the hydrophone network and the ROV. A broad, quiet man who could field strip a sonar transponder in 7 minutes, and didn't talk about what he'd heard through the hydrophones after dark. Park. Different Park from my other stories. This one was Korean-American, data analyst, responsible for processing the terabytes of acoustic data the network generated daily. She found the patterns I missed, Tomas, boat handler and diver, maintained the platform's waterline systems and drove the support vessel when we needed surface operations. And me, Marchetti, acoustics. My job was the whales. The hydrophone network was my instrument. 26 deep-water acoustic sensors deployed in a grid pattern along the migration corridor, each one tethered at a specific depth, each one recording continuously, each one listening to the ocean the way a microphone listens to a concert hall. The ocean is not silent. People think it is because they stand on the surface and hear waves and wind and nothing else. Below the surface, the ocean is one of the loudest environments on Earth. Whale songs travel thousands of miles. Ship engines create a constant industrial drone. Earthquakes, volcanic activity, ice calving. The planet's bones grinding against each other, and every sound transmitted through water at 1,500 meters per second, 4 times faster than through air. The hydrophones captured all of it. My job was to filter the noise and find the whales, to track their songs, their movements, their lives, to understand the migration, where they went, when they went, and why. The Eastern Pacific Corridor was one of the most important whale migration routes on the planet. Humpbacks, blues, grays, fins, they all pass through following the upwelling zones where cold, nutrient-rich water rose from the deep and fed the krill that fed the whales. The corridor ran roughly north-south, along the edge of the continental shelf, over the Mendocino Escarpment and the Deep Trench System. The whales had been using it for millions of years, since before humans existed, since before the ocean was the shape it is now. The corridor was ancient. And something in the corridor was ancient too. Blue whale songs are the loudest biological sounds on Earth. A blue whale call can reach 188 decibels, louder than a jet engine. The frequency is typically between 10 and 40 hertz, so low that it sits at the bottom edge of human hearing. Most of the call is in the infrasound range, below 20 hertz, which means you don't hear it so much as feel it. In the water, through a hydrophone, a blue whale call sounds like the voice of a god. Low, sustained, resonant. Each call lasts 10 to 30 seconds. The calls come in patterns, phrases, repeated, forming songs that can last for hours. Nobody knows with certainty what the songs mean. Mating displays, navigation, social bonding, communication across hundreds of miles of open ocean. When I started at the station, I would sit in the operations room during the night watch and listen, just listen. The hydrophones feeding the whale songs through the speakers, and the waveforms painting their patterns on the monitors. The sound filling the room like something physical. You could feel it in the floor, in the walls, in the liquid inside your own body, resonating at the frequency of an animal that was singing miles away, 1,000 feet below the surface, in total darkness, to an audience of other whales that were singing back. It was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard, and it was into that beauty that the other sound had crept, the anomaly. The hydrophone network had been recording it since 2021, 2 years before my rotation began. The previous team had flagged it in their reports. A low-frequency signal, very low, below the whale call range, below infrasound, at the boundary of what the hydrophones could detect, around 2 hertz, a sustained tone, not a pulse, continuous, unchanging, and coming from below, from the deep trench, from somewhere around 10,000 feet or deeper. The depth analysis was imprecise because the signal was so low frequency that the wavelength was longer than the hydrophone spacing. The previous team had classified it as geological, deep ocean tectonic settling, hydrothermal vent activity, the slow creep of the Pacific plate. Reasonable explanations. I accepted them initially. But the signal bothered me. Geological sounds are noisy, broadband, chaotic, the acoustic equivalent of gravel pouring down a slope. This signal was clean, a single frequency, sustained, like something was generating it. I mentioned this to Reeves during a maintenance check in month 2. He was replacing a hydrophone battery at the time, working with his hands, not looking at me. He said he'd noticed it too. He said he could feel it at night, through the platform's hull when the sea was calm and the generators were shut down for maintenance. He said it felt like standing on the chest of something breathing. I asked him what he thought it was. He said, "I think we're anchored above something's front door." He didn't elaborate. He went back to the battery. I didn't press. There were things at the station that I chose to handle the same way everyone else did, by not looking directly at them. The sonar anomaly, for instance. The 4 deep sonar buoys at the trench edge were designed for bathymetric survey, mapping the shape of the seafloor. They sent active pings downward and recorded the echoes, standard ocean floor mapping. The seafloor in the trench should have been consistent. Basalt, sediment, the geological features of a subduction zone. The sonar showed something else, a mass, at the bottom of the trench, not consistent with the surrounding geology. The echo return was wrong, too soft. Sonar bounces off hard surfaces, rock, metal, and returns a crisp echo. The mass at the bottom of the trench returned a muted echo, as if the surface was absorbing energy rather than reflecting it. Soft surfaces do that. Biological surfaces do that. The mass was large. The sonar resolution at that depth was limited. But the anomaly covered an area of approximately 3 square miles on the trench floor. And it moved, not dramatically, not enough to trigger automated alerts. But over the months, the sonar returns showed the anomaly's position shifting, fractionally, as if whatever was down there was slowly repositioning itself along the trench axis. I logged this. But the log went to NOAA. NOAA acknowledged receipt. No follow-up. March 2029. The migration began. The first tagged blue whales entered the corridor from the south. Animals that had spent the winter breeding in the warm waters off Central America and were now heading north to feed in the productive summer waters of the Gulf of Alaska. I tracked their positions as they moved through. Each whale a dot on the map, each dot a 150-ton life, moving at 5 knots through water that got progressively deeper as they approached the Mendocino Escarpment. The first tag went silent on March 12th. Whale BW-2027-0044. A female, 87 feet. Tagged 3 years prior off Baja, California. She'd been transmitting normally. Position updates every 4 hours, dive profile data, acoustic monitoring. At 0614 UTC, her tag reported from coordinates directly above the deep trench, at a depth of 3,200 feet. A feeding dive. Blue whales regularly dive to that depth to reach deep krill layers. At 10:14 UTC, the next scheduled transmission window, nothing. The tag didn't transmit. I waited. Tags occasionally miss a window. The whale dives too deep. The satellite angle is wrong. The transmitter malfunctions. Standard procedure. Wait for the next window. The next window came and went, and the next. For 72 hours, I waited. BW20270044 never transmitted again. I filed the tag failure with the Network Operations Center. Equipment malfunction. It happens. 1 whale, 1 tag. Coincidence? March 19th. 2 more tags went silent. BW 202801112 and BW202701198, both within the same 30-mile stretch of the corridor. Both at approximately 3,200 feet depth on their last reported dive, both within 6 hours of each other. I filed the reports. The coincidence expanded. April, 7 more. All in the same zone, all at the same depth, all during feeding dives, all without acoustic death signatures on the hydrophone network. When a whale dies, the hydrophones hear it. The vocalizations change, distress calls, thrashing, the wet percussion of a massive body in extremis. Then silence. A different silence than a living whale going quiet. The hydrophones know the difference. I know the difference. These whales weren't dying. They were disappearing. The tags were simply stopping mid-ocean, at depth, with no acoustic event to explain the cessation, as if the whale and their transmitters were being removed from the water column instantaneously. By May, as the count was 34 missing, I'd plotted every disappearance on the tracking map. The cluster was unmistakable. A tight grouping of dots, all within a 30-mile circle, all centered over the deep trench. The depth was consistent, 3,000 to 3,400 feet. I ran the acoustic analysis. I pulled every hydrophone recording from the disappearance zone for every event, and I analyzed the audio in the hours before and after each tag failure. The whale songs were changing, not in the way songs change normally. The gradual, seasonal evolution of phrase structure that's been documented in every whale population. This was different. The songs in the corridor were getting shorter. The long, sustained feeding calls, the sounds blue whales make when they're deep in a krill layer communicating abundance to others, were disappearing from the recordings. The whales in the corridor were no longer advertising food. They were no longer singing the songs that say, "Come here, there's food, this is a good place." Instead, the songs were shorter, higher frequency, more staccato. The cadence was familiar to me from a different context. I'd studied whale communication for 15 years. These were the vocal patterns associated with alarm, avoidance, threat detection. The whales in the migration corridor were afraid. Not all of them. The ones entering the corridor from the south were singing normally. But the ones approaching the 30-mile zone were changing their songs, and the ones passing through the zone, the ones that survived, came out the other side singing differently, quieter, shorter calls, less frequent, like animals that had just passed through a predator's territory and were still checking over their shoulders. I sent the acoustic analysis to NOAA. I flagged it as urgent, behavioral anomaly consistent with predator presence. NOAA acknowledged receipt. They requested additional data. They asked me to expand the acoustic monitoring window and increase the tag transmission frequency for whales approaching the zone. They did not send a research vessel. They did not authorize an investigation. They asked for more data. More data is what institutions request when they already know the answer and are not ready to act on it. June. The low-frequency signal, the 2 hertz hum from the deep trench that I'd been classifying as geological, changed. I noticed it at 0200 during a night watch. The operations room was dark except for the monitor glow, and the hydrophone feeds were playing through the speakers on low volume, the ambient soundscape of the deep Pacific, whale songs threading through the background noise of the ocean. I had the signal isolated on a secondary monitor, the anomalous 2 hertz tone, filtered and amplified, displayed as a waveform. For 2 years, the waveform had been a flat line with a slight oscillation, a sustained, featureless hum. At 0200 on June 14th, the waveform changed. It developed structure. The sustained tone broke into a pattern, a sequence of pulses, not regular like a heartbeat, complex, variable. The pulses came in groups, 3 short, 1 long, 2 short, a pause, 3 long, 1 short. Then the sequence repeated. Not exactly. There were variations, substitutions, as if the pattern was being generated by something that was composing rather than simply emitting. I recorded it. I ran the spectrographic analysis. The signal's frequency had shifted from 2 Hz to approximately 5 Hz. Still infrasound, still below human hearing, but higher than before, stronger. And the pattern, the pulsed structure, was new. It had never appeared in 2 years of recording. Something in the trench had changed what it was doing. I played the recording to Park at breakfast. She listened, studied the spectrogram, and then pulled up a comparison file, a blue whale feeding call. She put the 2 spectrograms side by side. The frequency was different. The whale call at 18 Hz, the anomalous signal at 5 Hz. The temporal structure was different. The whale call in regular pulses, the anomalous signal in its complex sequence. But the envelope, the shape of the amplitude curve, the rise and fall of each pulse was similar. Not identical, similar. Similar enough that Park looked at me and said, "It's mimicking them." I said that was a significant claim. She said, "Look at the envelope. The attack and decay profile of each pulse in the anomalous signal matches the attack and decay profile of a blue whale bee call, the feeding invitation call. The frequency is wrong, the timing is wrong, but the shape is right." She said, "It's like someone who doesn't speak the language trying to copy the sounds, getting the consonants right but the vowels wrong, close enough to be recognized. Not close enough to be natural, close enough to attract." I felt something cold settle in my chest. The bee call, the blue whale feeding call, is a signal that means food is here. It's the sound that draws other whales to a productive area. If something in the trench was generating a signal that mimicked the shape of a bee call at a frequency that whales could detect, even subconsciously, even at the level of infrasound that registered not as sound but as vibration, as a feeling, as an urge, it would act as a lure. "Come here. There's food. This is a good place." The whales were entering the corridor singing normal migration songs. As they approached the 30-mile zone, they encountered the signal. The signal didn't sound like a whale. Not at the conscious auditory level, but at the deep level, the level of biology, the level where a 150-ton animal makes decisions about where to dive and where to feed. The signal said, "Down, go down. There's food at 3,200 feet. The whales dove, and they didn't come back." I correlated the signal data with the tag disappearances. The correlation was 0.94, near perfect. Every tag failure occurred within 48 hours of a signal intensity peak in the whale's vicinity. The signal was calling them, and when they answered, they vanished. I presented this to Gibson, the station manager. He read the analysis. He looked at the correlation coefficient. He said, "You're telling me something in the trench is fishing for whales." I said the data was consistent with that interpretation. He said, "What kind of something?" I said, "I didn't know." He said, "Find out." The sonar anomaly, the soft echo mass on the trench floor, had grown or moved. The latest bathymetric scans showed the anomaly, covering approximately 5 square miles now, up from 3 at the start of my rotation. The mass was either expanding or repositioning along the trench axis, and the expansion correlated with the migration season. More whales in the corridor, larger anomaly, as if it was extending itself to cover more of the feeding zone. I authorized a deep ROV deployment to the disappearance coordinates. Reeves prepped Hadal 3. Our Nereid-class deep vehicle, rated to 12,000 feet, equipped with forward cameras, manipulator arms, sonar, and sampling equipment. The deployment was scheduled for June 20th. I briefed the crew on the objective: survey the ocean floor at 3,200 feet in the disappearance zone, photograph any debris, biological material, or geological features that might explain the tag failures. Standard scientific survey. Gibson pulled me aside after the brief. He said, "Be careful what you find." I asked him what he meant, and he said, "Some things at the bottom of the ocean have been there longer than we've been looking, and they don't like being seen." He said this without irony, without drama, in the same flat tone he used to discuss diesel fuel levels and deck maintenance schedules. Then he went to check the crane. June 20th, 700. Hadal 3 entered the water from the crane bay. The ROV descended at 2 meters per second, a controlled fall through the water column. The camera feed is showing the transition from surface light to twilight zone to midnight zone, blue to gray to black. By 1,000 feet, the sunlight was gone. The forward lamp activated automatically, a harsh white cone projecting downward into water that was now completely, utterly dark. Particulate drifted through the beam, marine snow. The constant rain of dead organic material sinking from the surface to the abyss. The ROV's HUD showed depth, pressure, temperature, heading. The numbers climbed: 2,000 feet, 2,500, 3,000. At 3,200 feet, the ROV leveled off. I was operating the vehicle from the control station in the operations room. Park beside me monitoring the sonar and acoustic feeds. Reeves standing behind us watching the camera. The seafloor appeared on the camera. Gray sediment, the flat, featureless plane of the deep ocean floor. Fine silt, occasional rocks, the tracks of deep-sea organisms. Worm trails, the marks of bottom-dwelling fish. Normal. The ROV moved forward along the programmed survey line, the camera sweeping left and right. For 10 minutes, there was nothing. Sediment. Rock. The quiet emptiness of the deep sea, 3,200 feet below the surface. As a mile from sunlight, in permanent darkness. And then, the bones. The camera caught the first one at the edge of the lamp's range. A pale shape against the gray sediment. I tilted the camera down and adjusted the ROV's approach. The shape resolved, a vertebra, a whale vertebra, massive. The bone was nearly 2 feet across, sitting on the sediment surface, clean, stripped of all tissue. No cartilage, no connective tissue, no decomposition residue. The bone was white, polished, as if it had been cleaned by something more thorough than any natural scavenging process. I moved the ROV forward. More bones, a rib cage. The long curved ribs of a blue whale, still partially articulated, lying on the seafloor like the hull of a capsized ship. The ribs were clean, white, stripped. Beyond the rib cage, a skull. The broad, flat skull of a baleen whale, resting on the sediment. The jawbone still attached, the baleen plates gone. Consumed, presumably, along with every other piece of soft tissue. The skull was the size of a car. I pulled the ROV back to gain altitude and switched to the wide-angle camera. The lamp's range expanded. The seafloor became visible in a wider arc, and the bones continued, I followed the spiral. The ROV descended along the bone path, the camera tracking the curve as it wound inward and downward toward the trench. 3,400 feet, 3,800, 4,200. The bones got older with depth, more encrusted, more buried, the sediment closing over them like a geological record of predation. At 5,000 feet, the seafloor began to slope steeply, the edge of the Mendocino Escarpment, the cliff face where the ocean floor dropped into the trench. The bones continued over the edge and down the cliff. I adjusted the ROV's descent angle and followed. The cliff face was basalt, dark, columnar, the hardened remnants of ancient volcanic flows, standard deep ocean geology. The bones were lodged in crevices and on ledges, positioned even here on a near vertical surface, with the same deliberate orientation, skulls inward, rib cages aligned, the spiral descending. At 6,000 feet, I began to notice that the cliff face was changing. The basalt was still there, but interspersed with something else. A lighter material, pale, not mineral. The texture was wrong. Under the ROV's lamp, the pale sections had a surface quality that was simultaneously smooth and ridged. Not the sharp fractured texture of volcanic rock, but something with flow, something that had been shaped by biology, not geology. I brought the ROV closer to the cliff face and activated the high-resolution camera. The detail was unmistakable. The pale material was organic, calcified tissue, the same bone-colored, ridged, ancient surface that I would later learn to recognize in every report, every photograph, every nightmarish frame of footage from every trench and canyon and deep place on this planet where something old has been sitting for longer than the ocean has been its current depth. The cliff face of the Mendocino Escarpment was not entirely basalt. Parts of it were something else. Parts of it were alive. At 7,000 feet, the trench walls narrowed. The ROV was now descending between two faces of rock, the classic V-shape of a deep ocean trench, the walls closing in as the depth increased. The lamp illuminated both walls simultaneously. And on both walls, the pale calcified surface was visible, not patches anymore, continuous. Both walls of the trench, from 7,000 feet downward, were calcified tissue, ridged, segmented, encrusted with deep-sea organisms, barnacles, tube worms, bacterial mats that had been growing on the surface for millennia, obscuring it, making it look geological to any casual observation. But beneath the incrustation, the surface had structure, parallel ridges running along the trench axis, curving gently, segmented. The ridges on the left wall mirrored the ridges on the right wall, not randomly, symmetrically. The trench wasn't a geological formation. It was a gap, a space between two sides of something. The way a closed mouth is a line between an upper jaw and a lower jaw. The realization came to me in stages, each one worse than the last. The stage 1, the trench walls were biological, not rock, calcified tissue, an organism. Stage 2, both walls were part of the same organism. The symmetry wasn't coincidence, it was anatomy. The trench was the space between two segments or two surfaces of a single body. Stage 3, the organism was enormous. The trench extended for miles in both directions along the escarpment. Whatever I was descending between was not a creature in a trench. The creature was the trench. Or rather, the trench was the visible gap at the top of something buried beneath the ocean floor. The way a whale's blowhole is the visible surface feature of an animal that is mostly underwater. The organism was in the seafloor, under it, part of it. What I could see, The calcified walls of the trench was the equivalent of looking at a whale and seeing only the dorsal fin. At 8,000 feet, the ROV's depth rating was exceeded. The vehicle was rated to 12,000, but the operating protocol limited dives in unmapped terrain to 2/3 of maximum depth. I should have turned back. I didn't. The spiral of bones continued downward between the narrowing walls. The bones here were ancient, not encrusted, but fossilized, mineralized. The oldest remains on this spiral had been here for geological time periods, thousands of years, tens of thousands. The organism had been feeding in this corridor since before human civilization began, since before humans existed, since before whales were whales. I saw bones at depth that didn't match any modern cetacean species. Smaller, different morphology. The ancestors of whales, the evolutionary predecessors, the species that had lived and migrated and been consumed by this thing since the ocean was young. At 9,200 feet, the ROV's lamp caught something that stopped my hands on the controls. The bone spiral, which had been winding inward and downward between the calcified walls, reached its terminus. The center of the spiral, the point toward which every skull was aimed, every ribcage aligned, every vertebral column curved. The center was a gap in the trench wall, an opening, a cavity in the organism's surface, roughly circular, 15 feet across. The bones converged on this opening and disappeared into it. The most recent kills, the freshest bones, the whitest, the least encrusted, were closest to the opening. Some were partially inside it. A whale skull, wedged in the aperture, the jawbone extending outward, the cranium swallowed by the cavity. The ROV's lamp penetrated the opening. What I saw inside was not a cave. The interior surface was smooth, pale, wet, glistening under the lamplight. Not with seawater, but with a biological fluid, viscous, slightly luminescent. The walls of the cavity were lined with structures I recognized from comparative anatomy, villi, absorptive tissue, the interior of a digestive space. The bones that entered the cavity didn't come back out because the soft tissue was digested and the bones were passed through and deposited on the outside. The spiral of bones wasn't art, it wasn't communication, it was waste, the excretory pattern of an organism that consumed whales, digested everything except the calcium structure, and expelled the remains in a geometric pattern that was a function of its own body's peristaltic rhythm. The spiral was the shape of digestion, the geometry of a gut processing 150-ton meals and extruding the bones in the pattern of its own muscular contractions. I pulled the ROV back from the opening. I angled the camera upward. The trench walls rose above me. Two calcified surfaces, narrowing toward the seafloor above, closing the gap. From below, looking up, I could see what I hadn't been able to see from above. The walls moved, not visibly, not at a speed the eye could detect. But the ROV's distance sensors registered it. The walls were contracting, slowly, millimeter by millimeter. A slow, rhythmic compression of the space between the two segments, followed by a relaxation. The gap between the walls was breathing. The organism was breathing. The low-frequency signal, the 5 Hz hum that Park had identified as mimicry of a whale-feeding call, was the acoustic byproduct of this respiration. The organism breathed, and the breath generated a sound wave that propagated through the water column, up to the surface, into the ears and bodies of the whales in the corridor, telling them, "Come down. There's food here. Come to 3,200 feet. Dive." The organism was not hunting. It was not chasing, it was calling. Sitting at the bottom of the ocean, buried in the seafloor, indistinguishable from the geology it had been part of for millions of years, and calling, patient. The whales came to it. They always had. Since before the migration routes were studied, since before the ocean was mapped, since before humans built ships. The whales had been diving into the corridor, and some of them had not come back. And nobody had noticed because the ocean is vast and the losses were small. A percentage of the migration, a statistical dip in the population models, attributed to natural mortality, to disease, to ship strikes, to predation by orca. The organism took just enough, a sustainable harvest, a percentage that the population could absorb without collapsing. Patient predation on a geological timescale. I began the ascent at 9,200 feet. The ROV climbed between the narrowing walls, the lamp illuminating the calcified surface on both sides, the ridges, the segments, the ancient encrusted tissue that had been mistaken for rock by every survey, every sonar pass, every geological map of this trench since bathymetric mapping began, at 8,000 feet. As the ROV crossed through a narrow section between two prominent ridges, the walls moved. Not the slow respirator contraction I'd been observing. A faster movement, a spasm. The trench walls compressed laterally by approximately 6 feet in 2 seconds. The ROV was caught in the displacement. The water pressure spike slammed the vehicle sideways, spinning it, the camera whirling. The lamp swept across the calcified surface and caught, for 1 frame, 2 frames, something I haven't been able to adequately describe. A structure at the junction of 2 segments, where the ridges met, where the calcified plates overlapped. The organism's surface changed. The calcification was thinner here, the tissue beneath more visible, more alive, less stone and more flesh, and in the flesh, set into the junction like a tool in a socket. There was an opening, a gullet, a mouth. Not a mouth in any vertebrate sense, no lips, no jaw mechanism, an aperture lined with rows of translucent teeth. The teeth were needle-thin and curved backward, spiraling inward in concentric rows. They were not designed for chewing. They were designed for one thing, ensuring that whatever entered did not come back out. The aperture was the opening I'd seen at the center of the bone spiral, the digestive cavity, the feeding organ, seen now from the side in the convulsive light of a spinning ROV lamp. The structure was clear. The trench was the organism. The gap between the walls was its body, closed, dormant. When prey arrived, lured by the acoustic signal to the right depth, the right location, the walls opened fractionally. The aperture at the center received the prey, and the walls closed. The whale, alive, was drawn into the digestive space. The tag, crushed by the muscular pressure of the walls, stopped transmitting. The ocean above showed nothing. No blood, no debris, no acoustic signature of distress. Just a whale that dove and didn't come back. Clean, silent, efficient. The ROV stabilized, the camera refocused. I was ascending too fast. The tether was straining. The vehicle's sensors were alarming. The walls had returned to their resting position. The spasm, was it a reflex? A response to the ROV's presence? Or was it feeding? There were no whales nearby. The ROV was too small to trigger a feeding response. Maybe the organism had simply twitched, the way a sleeping animal twitches when something brushes against its skin. Either way, I had been between the jaws of something that ate blue whales. And the jaws had moved, and I was pulling a vehicle worth $3 million up through the dark as fast as the tether would allow. And every second between 9,200 feet and the surface was a second spent inside the mouth of something that could close at any time. Hadal 3 surfaced at 14:30. Reeves operated the crane to bring the vehicle aboard. The camera housing was cracked. The pressure spike from the spasm had exceeded the tolerance at that depth. The manipulator arm was bent. The sonar dome was dented. The vehicle looked like it had been squeezed. I downloaded the footage and the sensor data in the operations room. The full crew watched. I didn't narrate. The footage spoke for itself. The bones, the spiral, the descent between the calcified walls, the aperture, the gullet, the spasm. Nobody spoke until it was over. Gibson said, "How big?" I said the trench extends for approximately 40 miles along the escarpment. He said, "The whole trench?" I said, "I don't know. The organism is at minimum 40 miles along the axis I surveyed. It may extend further in both directions. The sonar anomaly covers 5 square miles of trench floor. That's what we can detect from the surface. The organism's body is in the seafloor, buried, calcified, indistinguishable from the geology. The 5 square miles might be a fraction." Gibson looked at the ocean through the operations room window, gray, flat, calm, hiding everything, and said nothing for a long time. I sent the footage and data to NOAA through the encrypted uplink. The response came in 4 hours. The station was to cease ROV operations immediately. All data was to be classified. A retrieval vessel was being dispatched. Estimated arrival, 72 hours. We were to continue hydrophone monitoring, but were not to deploy any equipment below the surface. We were to maintain normal operational appearance. The classification level was high enough that Gibson, retired Navy, 30 years of clearance, looked at the header and went pale. We waited. The hydrophone feeds continued. The whale songs continued, shorter now, more urgent. The migration still passing through the corridor because the whales had no other route, because the corridor had been their path for millions of years, because the organism had positioned itself along the only deep water channel that the whales could use. Positioned, patient, fed by the migration it had been harvesting since before any living biologist species existed. The low-frequency signal continued. The lure, the mimic, the false feeding call pulsing through the water at 5 hertz, drawing whales down to 3,200 feet, to the gap between the calcified walls, to the aperture and the spiraling teeth and the digestive cavity. Every 48 hours, another tag went silent. The retrieval vessel arrived on June 23rd. We transferred. The station was not decommissioned. It was restaffed, quietly, by a crew I wasn't introduced to. Military. The hydrophone network stayed active. The data feed was rerouted. I was told, politely, that my rotation was ending early due to equipment issues. I was given a separation package and a non-disclosure agreement. I signed it. What else was I going to do? They gave me a job at the National Aquarium in Baltimore. Marine education. Outreach. I narrate whale shows for school groups, standing in front of a 60-foot window while a humpback whale model hangs from the ceiling, and I to children how these are the largest animals that have ever lived, how they migrate thousands of miles every year, how their songs can be heard across entire oceans. The children are amazed. Their faces light up when I play the whale songs through the speakers. I smile. I tell them that the oceans are vast and beautiful and full of wonder and that we must protect them. I do not tell them what I found at 9,200 feet between the walls of a trench in the eastern Pacific. I do not tell them that something has been eating the whales since before their species existed. I do not tell them that the ocean, which I spent my career loving, it contains things so old and so patient that the concept of conservation is meaningless. You cannot protect a species from a predator that was feeding on that species' ancestors 40 million years before the species evolved. The debrief lasted 5 weeks. I gave them everything: the footage, the acoustic data, the tag correlations, the bone spiral photographs, the organism's tissue samples that Hadal 3's manipulator had collected before the spasm. The tissue analysis came back: calcified organic material, carbon dated to approximately 8 million years, the age of the surface layer, the most recent growth. The deeper tissue, estimated from mineralization patterns, was older, significantly older. The organism had been growing in that trench, the Miocene, since before modern whales existed, since before the migration corridor existed in its current form. The organism didn't follow the whales came to the organism. The migration route, the path that blue whales had been traveling for millions of years, was shaped by the organism's presence, the nutrient upwelling that attracted krill to the corridor, that fed the whales, that made this stretch of ocean one of the most productive feeding grounds in the Pacific. It was caused, at least in part, by the organism's metabolic processes. Its body, buried in the seafloor, generated heat. The heat drove upwelling. The upwelling fed plankton. The plankton fed krill. The krill fed whales. And the organism fed on the whales. A closed loop, a self-sustaining feeding system maintained for geological time. The organism didn't just eat the whales, it farmed them. 7 years now. Every Wednesday at lunch, I close my office door at the aquarium and I open my laptop and I pull up the NOAA hydrophone archives. The archives are public. The acoustic monitoring program's data is available to any researcher with credentials. The Pacific Deep Station is still operational, restaffed, reclassified, the data still flowing. I can't access the classified feeds, but the public archives include the broad acoustic monitoring from the region. And if you filter for the right frequency, if you know to look at 5 Hz, if you know what the waveform of a false feeding call looks like, if you know what a whale lure sounds like when something ancient is mimicking the voice of the largest animal on Earth to draw it into the dark, you can see it. The signal is still there. Every Wednesday, without fail. Stronger in March through November. Weaker in winter, matching the migration season. The organism feeds seasonally. Patient, tuned to a cycle it has maintained for longer than the species it consumes has existed. I also check the whale population data. The blue whale population in the eastern Pacific has been declining. Not dramatically, not enough to trigger conservation alarms. The decline is within the noise margin of population surveys, natural mortality, the models say. Environmental variability, climate change affecting krill abundance, reasonable explanations, each one technically possible, none of them correct. The population is declining because something in the Mendocino Trench is eating approximately 2 to 3% of the migration each year, and has been eating 2 to 3% of the migration every year for millions of years. And the models don't account for it, because the models don't know the organism exists. The whales, though, the whales know. I can see it in the routes are shifting. Slowly. Year by year, the corridor is narrowing. Whales that used to pass directly over the trench are detouring, swinging wider, taking longer routes, avoiding the 30-mile zone. They don't know why, the same way a gazelle doesn't know why it avoids a particular stretch of savanna, but they avoid it. An inherited caution, encoded in behavior over millions of years of predation. The ones that avoided the zone survived and passed the avoidance on. The ones that didn't are bones in a spiral on the ocean floor. Evolution in action. Predator and prey, locked in a relationship older than either species' current form. Sometimes, after I've checked the data, I walk down to the aquarium's main hall. The big tank, blue light, filtered, calm, small sharks cruising, rays gliding, schools of silver fish turning in unison, children pressing their faces against the glass, pointing. And through the speakers, the ambient track, whale songs recorded in the Pacific, beautiful and vast and ancient. I listen to the songs and I hear the thing beneath them, the 5 hertz pulse, the false call, the lure at the bottom of the ocean, patient and hungry and old, calling to the whales the way it has called since before there were whales, waiting in the trench it built from its own body, feeding in a spiral, breathing in the dark. The ocean is not what we think it is. The ocean is 71% of the Earth's surface, and we have mapped less than 20% of the seafloor in detail. The trenches, the deepest places, the places no sunlight reaches, the places where the pressure would crush a human body into something unrecognizable. Those places are the least explored environments on this planet, less mapped than the surface of Mars. And in those unmapped places, in the dark, in the pressure, in the cold, things have been living for longer than we've been a species. Things that were old when the first mammals entered the ocean and evolved into whales. Things that were old when the first fish evolved swim bladders. Things that were old when the ocean itself was young. And they're still there, still feeding, still patient. And every Wednesday in an office at an aquarium in Baltimore, a woman who used to count whales for a living sits at her laptop and watches the number go down. One by one, tag by tag, voice by voice, the count drops. The spiral grows, and the signal continues. And beneath the sound of whale songs playing through the aquarium speakers, if you listen very carefully, there is something else. Low, constant, almost like breathing, almost like a call, almost like the voice of something that has been singing the same song since before there was anyone to hear it. From the bottom of an ocean that is deeper and darker and more alive than anyone who has never looked directly into it can possibly understand. And the whales hear it, and they dive, and some of them don't come back. And the ocean keeps every secret it has ever been given.